3 years ago, a father lost his twin daughters, believing they were gone forever. But fate had a cruel twist in store. One day, on a dusty bus winding through the Wild West, he found them singing songs as if nothing had broken their world. Yet the truth he uncovered that day shattered not only his heart, but his entire life, before it had even truly begun. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. And if these stories move you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, get ready because this is a tale you won't forget. They told me the wind always speaks first, before storms, before bullets, before men make their choices. That morning, it didn't howl. It whispered, low, steady, like it was ashamed of what was about to unfold. The dirt in Hollow Bend tasted different that day, sharp, bitter, metallic, like it already knew blood was coming. Ash-gray clouds hovered low above the chapel's steeple, dragging their bellies across the sky like heaven itself had grown too heavy to lift. I could feel every eye in town watching me, though none dared to meet mine for long. I remember the chill in my wrists from the rope. Rough, cut from barn feet, tied by hands that had once waved kindly across Sunday pews. They bound me at the steps of the chapel, right beneath the cross, because I had loved the wrong kind of man. Or maybe I hadn't even loved him yet. Maybe I had only stood close, listened too long, smiled too softly at someone the town decided was untouchable. His name was Calum, but to them, he was only the boy from the ridge. The half-shadow. The one with eyes like midnight rivers and silence that said more than their sermons ever did. He never touched me. Not then. Not when we watched the foxes run under the moon. Not when he spoke of water spirits and wind trails in the shape of grief. But they saw enough to decide. I heard the branding iron before I saw it. The hiss of it finding fire again. A sound like serpents kissing. Jed Tomley held it, the preacher's nephew. The sheriff's favorite. The town's poison. He always wanted something from me. Attention. Obedience. Reverence. I had offered none, and so he made a ceremony of my refusal. The preacher stood to my right. His Bible trembled in his hands, though his voice did not. He said I had strayed from purity. That this mark was not a punishment, but a lesson one burned into flesh, so others might learn not to follow. The sheriff said nothing. He only looked away. When the iron touched my cheek, I didn't scream for them. My voice tore out of me, but it wasn't for the crowd, or the preacher, or even Jed. It was for Calum, for the wind, for the river that had once reflected our shadows as one. The pain was fire, then white, then silence. When it was done, they left me there on my knees, in the dust, with the brand still smoking on my face. A symbol carved into my skin like a broken language. I think they expected me to weep, to beg, to leave. But I did none of those. I walked, barefoot, bloodied, back to my father's ranch 2 miles out of town, past the general store where whispers were cheaper than flour, past the saloon with its smudged windows and hungover cowards, past the blacksmith who used to give me licorice as a girl and now refused to meet my eyes. The ranch was dying, had been for years. The house leaned like a tired man. The barn sagged with its own sorrow. Fences drooped, gate rusted, but it was mine now, or what was left of it. I lit the fire that night without flint, without prayer. I boiled water. I sat in silence. I did not cry. The days that followed folded into each other like thin pages. I tended the land, not to grow, but to remember how to move. I patched the roof with warped wood, chased out the raccoons nesting in the chimney. I covered every mirror. Not because of vanity, I just didn't need to see the scar. It was already inside me. They said I was cursed, that I had called the shadows down from the hills, that the earth would not grow where I walked. But the truth is, the apple tree bloomed again that spring. Just 3 blossoms, shy and pink like something daring to return. I never saw Calum again. Not then. Not when I needed him most. I waited some nights, candle in the window, breath held too long. But the ridge remained quiet. I told myself he had left for his own safety. For mine. That he didn't know what they did to me. But sometimes I wondered if he knew and stayed away anyway. I couldn't blame him. The town forgot me quickly. It was easier that way. They don't carve shame into their memories like they do into faces. They moved on, mouths full of sugar and sermons, eyes full of fear they'd never name. But I remembered every glance, every silence, every hand that did nothing. There were nights when I could still smell the iron, still feel its ghost pressing into my cheek. The scar healed, but it twisted my smile, made my skin itch when storms came near. It wasn't just skin that burned that day. It was the last soft part of me. And still, I stayed. Not out of pride, not even revenge, but because I refused to let them make me disappear. My father had built that house with his own hands. His voice still echoed in the rafters. He had told me once, "Don't ever leave your story half-written because someone else doesn't like the plot." So I stayed, quiet, watchful, growing roots where they tried to burn me down. And then, one evening, a year after the brand, a rider came. I heard the hooves before I saw him. Slow, deliberate, not rushed like guilt, but steady like memory. I stood on the porch, rifle leaning behind the door, breath tight. I didn't expect him. Not anymore, not after so long. But the moment I saw that silhouette, braided hair catching dusk, I knew it was Calum. He didn't speak. Didn't smile, just nodded once and tied his horse near the well. He moved like a part of the wind, like he had always belonged to this place more than any of us ever had. He handed me a bundle wrapped in hide. Inside a carved wolf, small and dark, with eyes made of obsidian chips. I remembered that carving. I had once admired it when he whittled it by the river. He had smiled then, said it was meant for protection. I held it now, fingers trembling. Throat too tight for words. He touched his chest once over his heart and then walked toward the barn. He stayed there that night, and I didn't stop him. I slept near the fire, the wolf figurine beside me. That night, for the first time in a long while, the scar on my cheek did not burn. But the town had eyes. And soon, so did their fear. They always feared what they didn't understand. And they never understood Calum. The morning after he returned, the sky was painted in the same gray silence as the day I was branded. It felt like time had looped, like the earth was warning me that memory and fate might walk the same road. Calum hadn't spoken a word, but his presence said enough to stir old ashes in town. I knew how they'd read it. A second trespass, a provocation. I'd learned by then that nothing caused panic in small men like proof that their punishments hadn't broken you. I spent that morning tending the broken fence along the east pasture. Calum stood nearby, mending boards beside me without instruction. It was like he remembered the rhythm of my days, when I gathered kindling, when I fed the hens, when I walked to the river at dusk and stood still for far too long. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to console me, and for that I was grateful. Words felt foreign in those days, like broken teeth in a quiet mouth. But even without speaking, something passed between us, something shaped by silence and shared exile. He'd been gone over a year. I wanted to ask where he had gone, why he had not come sooner. But when I looked at him, I saw that same brand carved in different ways across his face, not in skin, but in the hard lines around his mouth, the tiredness in his eyes. We were both carrying wounds that couldn't be seen. By the third day, he'd begun chopping firewood like the winter would never end. Pile after pile, stacked in clean rows. He repaired the chicken coop, reinforced the barn door, and tied dozens of dream catchers across the rafters with sinew and bone. He moved with ritual like everything he did was an offering to someone who no longer lived. And still, no words. On the fifth day, I found the wolf carving beside my bed, its head turned now, as if it had been watching me while I slept. I touched its back, traced the smooth tail, and felt something pulse in me like breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That night, I lit a second candle at the window. The next morning, I found something on my porch. A dead crow. Its wings were broken backwards, its neck twisted clean. No blood. Just death, clean and posed. A message. I buried it beneath the apple tree, hands trembling harder than they should have. I didn't tell Calum, But when he came in that evening, his eyes lingered on the tree longer than usual. He placed another bundle on the table, this one wrapped in deerskin. Inside was a ring of sage and a small jar of charcoal paste. Protection. Again. By the end of the week, I could feel it building the tension in town. I hadn't seen them, but I knew they'd seen us. I knew how their whispers worked, how fast fear turned to anger, how easily sermons became sentences. And then came the fire. It was just after dusk when I saw the orange bloom behind the barn. For a second, I thought it was the sun setting late until the smoke began to crawl. Calum was faster than me, already out the door before I could grab the bucket. We ran without words, feet pounding the earth, hearts slamming against ribs like fists against locked doors. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the coop. It was the scarecrow, the one I dressed in my father's old coat, the one that stood watch near the fence line. Someone had doused it in kerosene, lit it, and left. Flames danced wild across the arms, black smoke twisting into the sky like a sermon gone wrong. Calum stood motionless, watching it burn. Then he walked forward and pulled the smoldering frame to the ground with his bare hands. His palms blistered instantly, skin-searing, but he didn't flinch. He smothered the fire with his coat, pressed ash into ash until all that remained was a ruined shape in the dirt. We didn't speak of it. We didn't need to. The message was clear. Leave. But I'd already learned that you can only run so many times before the ghosts follow you anyway. That night, I wrote in my father's journal for the first time since his death. The ink bled across the page, shaky and unsure. But I wrote everything: the fire, the crow, the silence, the return. I wrote to remind myself that memory mattered, that I was still here. Calum slept in the barn again. I don't know if he ever really slept. Sometimes I'd see him walk past the window in the dark, bare-chested, barefoot, painted with charcoal streaks. He was preparing for what, I didn't know. But he had always known more about what the land whispered than I ever could. Days passed, and then the preacher came, not to speak, not to bless, but to deliver a folded letter with no signature. Inside it read, "There are things in the woods that don't belong. You're one of them. No name, no threat, just a warning cut like a curse." Calum read it without emotion. Then he lit it on fire, using a sliver of the same match they'd once used to brand me. I watched the flame eat the page and felt a strange calm settle in me, not peace, but resolve. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them, not of fire, not even of the scar I saw each morning in the reflection of the kettle's steel curve. They'd done their worst already. All that remained now was survival. But Calum was restless. He began carving more, not just wolves, but owls, serpents, bear claws. He left them all around the house, above doorways, under floorboards, inside the hearth. He said nothing of their purpose, but I understood. These were not decorations, they were defenses. Then, one night, the dreams began. Not mine. His. I would wake to hear him murmuring in the dark, words I didn't know in a language older than the hills. He thrashed. He wept. One night, he screamed loud enough to startle the horses. I sat beside him in the hay, held his hand until the spasm stopped. His skin was cold, his breath shallow. When he opened his eyes, they weren't quite his, not yet. I saw something ancient there, something that didn't belong to this place or this century. That night, I didn't sleep either, because I knew whatever had started wasn't just about us anymore. Something old had been disturbed, and the town was about to pay for forgetting its debts. You can ignore pain for a time. You can bury it beneath chores, silence, or old hymn melodies. But you can't ignore hunger, and the land had grown hungry. It started with the animals. The first to vanish was a black lamb from the Peary farm. Then 2 more from the Gallo ranch. Within days, the hens stopped laying. The cows refused to be milked, and dogs howled through the night as if mourning a death that hadn't happened yet, or one that was coming. No one spoke aloud of what they feared, but you could feel it in the way doors locked earlier, the way men stared too long at tree lines, the way women clutched their children's shoulders in silence. The prairie had changed. There was something in the soil now, something that listened. And in my house, Calum no longer slept. He moved like a shadow, silent, watchful. When I did hear his voice again, it was in the early hours of the 4th day after the fire, while the sky was still a deep bruise of violet. They called it Antuka, he said without turning to me. He was standing at the window, shirtless, with dark paint smeared across his chest and arms. It lives where blood was spilled, and never repaid. The word hung in the room like smoke. Is it real? I asked. He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed outside. And somehow, that silence was more terrifying than anything he could have said. By that afternoon, the preacher's wife had vanished. Her name was Marion, a quiet woman, always smiling but with eyes that never quite matched her lips. She'd been kind to me once, years ago, slipping me a bundle of bread when others crossed the street to avoid me. That kindness didn't protect her. They found her shawl snagged on a barbed fence outside the Miller homestead, red threads torn and tangled like veins. The rest of her was never found. But I knew better than to believe she'd simply wandered off. No one wandered off anymore, not here. The preacher didn't weep. He didn't pray. He blommed. He stood in the center of the square that evening, coat whipping in the wind, Bible clutched in both hands like a weapon. His voice cracked with fury, not grief. "She let the wolf back in," he cried. "Finger pointed in the direction of my land, and now we all bleed for her sin." No one stopped him. No one disagreed. They never had to raise pitchforks. Their silence had always been sharper. Calum carved through the night. He didn't eat. He barely drank. The house filled with shapes, twisted roots, effigies, symbols I didn't recognize. He painted the walls in red ochre, every doorway sealed with lines that made my head ache when I stared too long. He told me to stay inside, not to speak to anyone, not to go near the woods at dusk. And still I walked, because I couldn't live like that again, imprisoned by their fear or his. The river path was empty, quiet, but the trees no longer moved with the wind, they resisted it. The air felt wrong, like breath held too long in a chest. And when I reached the bank, I saw something waiting there. A deer, but not like any deer I'd ever seen. Its body was thin, translucent in parts, ribs showing through like glass. Its eyes were completely black, not just dark black, like holes punched through the world. And it didn't move when I stepped closer. It watched me, not with fear, with recognition, like it knew me. I don't know how long I stood there. I only remember the sudden snap of a twig behind me, Calum, grabbing my arm, dragging me backward without a word. I didn't fight him, not then, because in that moment I realized it hadn't just been watching me, it had been following. That night, Calum finally told me the rest. Long ago, before the town was ever mapped or named, his people buried a child in the forest. A girl. A child who died wrong, not in battle, not from sickness, but from betrayal. She had been traded, sold for safety by settlers in the first winter, given to an enemy tribe in exchange for food. The land had rejected that act, and it remembered. Antuka, he said, wasn't a spirit. It was a hunger, a need for balance where balance had been broken. It took only from the bloodlines that benefited the descendants of the cowardly bargain. It waited, quiet, until it was awakened by fresh betrayal. I thought of the girl, and I thought of myself. "What do you mean awakened?" I asked. He looked at me. "Finally, when they branded you," he said, "they didn't just shame you. They offered you." The words hit like frost against bone. Me. I had been their offering. Again. And just like that child, I had been left at the edge of something ancient and ravenous. In the days that followed, the town began to unravel. Cattle were found in trees, literally, limbs tangled in high branches with no sign of struggle. A child in the schoolhouse began speaking in tongues, and one morning the well ran red. The preacher called it plague. Others whispered the word curse. But none dared come near me, which suited me fine, because for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. Not safe, not whole, but no longer small. Calum and I prepared the house not for defense, but for the final act. He said it would come for him, or for me, or both. And when it did, we had only one chance. Give back what had been taken. Balance? But how do you repay a blood debt that isn't yours? How do you make peace with ghosts that were never given names? On the 7th night, the storm came. Not rain, not lightning, but wind, like breath from a broken throat. It screamed through the shutters, rattled the bones hung over the doors, and drove every living thing to the ground in silence. I sat by the hearth, holding the old wolf carving, waiting. And in the distance, through the broken howl of the wind, I heard it. A voice. Not Calum's. Not mine. Something that sounded like 1,000 children weeping at once, layered beneath a single question. Will you remember me? There are things you learn only when the world stops pretending to be safe. Like how a shadow can stretch even without a light source. How silence can scream louder than thunder. And how your own heartbeat can feel like someone else's footstep just behind you. That night the wind howled with voices not born of any mouth, something broke in me. Not in a way that made me weaker. No, it was the kind of break that let the truth seep in. And I think that's when I finally understood what Calum meant when he said, "This isn't about you. It never was. But now it has to be." Because someone had to choose to remember. The fire came without flame. Not the burning kind, not heat and smoke and panic, but the fire of memory, of grief, of eyes opening wide for the first time in years. I couldn't sleep after that voice asked me, "Will you remember me?" Because I realized I didn't know who it was. The girl they gave away? The child Calum spoke of? Or 1,000 forgotten souls behind her, waiting to be remembered by someone, anyone? Me. Calum was gone when I woke. Not like before, not in the barn or the woods. Gone. No tracks, no scent, no warmth where he had been, as if the house had never held him at all. But I knew better. He had gone to face it alone. And I wouldn't let him. The wind had died, but the air remained tight, like something was pressing against the skin of the world from the inside. I dressed slowly, my hands trembling not with fear but anticipation. My body already knew what was coming. It's strange how calm you can become when you accept that you might die. I took nothing with me but the wolf carving. It had sat on my windowsill since I was a girl, left by Calum the night they branded me. I never asked why he gave it to me. Maybe because I already knew. Even when they marked me with fire, someone else had tried to leave me a shape, something to hold on to. Something ancient. Something wild. Something free. I followed the old river path, same as I had before. But this time, it wasn't the trees that frightened me. It was what I saw between them. Figures. Not people, not anymore. Tall, with limbs too long. Their faces covered in ash and cloth, like mourning veils made of scorched linen. They didn't move, they only watched. Each one clutching something. A doll, a rosary, a hammer, a piece of rope. Tokens of what had been taken from them. Memories given form. Dipmel Fleisch. They stood in silence as I passed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel shame. He felt seen. He was waiting in the hollow. Calum. On his knees in the center of the clearing, bare-chested, covered in that same red paint, only this time it pulsed. Not with light, but with breath. Like his skin itself had become part of something older, something breathing beneath the soil. He didn't turn when I stepped forward, but he spoke. You came. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The thing emerged slowly, not from the woods, from the earth. It rose like smoke, first a shimmer in the air, a warping of space, and then a shape, not fixed, ever changing. Sometimes it looked like the deer, sometimes like a woman, then like the preacher's wife, then like me, and finally like a child. A girl barefoot with long tangled hair and eyes too old for her face. She didn't speak. She only reached forward toward Calum, and he bowed his head. I realized then he had always planned to offer himself. Not to die, but to carry it. The debt. The memory. The fire that still burned for justice. No. The word left my throat before I knew it had formed. Calum looked up. Startled, the child stilled. "No," I said again, louder this time. "You don't get to carry this alone." I stepped between them. She watched me. Not with anger, with recognition. Again, like before, like she knew me. And maybe she did. Maybe we were the same, offered, discarded, forgotten. Maybe that's why it chose me. "I remember you," I whispered. And the world shook. Not violently, but deeply. As if the ground sighed. As if the trees finally exhaled after centuries of breath held. The child blinked, then smiled. A soft, sad thing, like she had waited too long for this. She stepped forward, and I felt her fingers on my wrist. Cold, not cruel, just empty. Like she had nothing left to take, only to give. And in that moment, I saw it. Her life, her death, the trade, the hands that pushed her away, the fire, the silence, the rage, and the hunger that came after. Not vengeance, balance. I saw the whole shape of the pain that had lived beneath our feet for generations, unspoken, unnamed. And I knew what she wanted. Not revenge, truth, witness. I knit it. Calem beside me. We said nothing, and in silence she disappeared. Not like smoke, like a wound finally closed. We walked back in daylight. The woods felt warm for the first time. The watchers, the tall veiled figures were gone. The wind was soft, and the trees no longer resisted it. Calem didn't speak. Neither did I. We didn't have to. Because for once, silence didn't mean shame. It meant peace. But peace is not safety. The town was waiting when we returned. Armed, united, afraid. They hadn't felt the shift in the earth. They hadn't seen her smile. They only knew that something had changed and they would not be part of it. They would fight it. Just like they always had. But I wasn't that girl anymore. And if they wanted to silence the truth again, they would have to look me in the eyes first. They watched me like I was the problem. Not the hunger. Not the fire. Not the silence. Me. The girl they thought had forgotten her place, or worse, remembered too much of it. The first time I felt true fear in Coldwater wasn't when I found Calem in the barn, or when I heard the voice in the wind, or even when I knelt before the child made of smoke and grief. It was when I came back to town the next morning and found my father's store burned to the ground. The ash was still warm. The shelves collapsed inward, black and skeletal. The old rocking chair he used to nap in was nothing more than warped wood and twisted nails. They hadn't even tried to hide it. A message, a warning, or maybe just revenge. They didn't say a word as I stood in the middle of the road, covered in soot, smelling of earth and old bones and something older. They just stared from behind their curtains, behind their windows, their hands clutching their Bibles like crosses could stop whatever it was they feared I'd become. I felt it crawling in the back of their throats, the word they wouldn't say out loud. Witch. Not the kind with spells or broomsticks, the kind who remembers. Calem stood beside me, calm as ever. They feared him too, but differently. Not with superstition, with old hate. The kind that runs in the blood. The kind that gets passed down like land and rifles and grudges. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a symbol of what they tried to bury under fences and scripture. He was the reminder, and now I was too. We didn't say much that day. He led me to the canyon trail, past the abandoned mission where the oldest stones still bore carvings not of saints, but symbols, warnings, or prayers. I wasn't sure which. We sat beneath the dry overhang, watching the vultures wheel above us like they knew a storm was coming. Not one of wind or rain, but of reckoning. Calem finally spoke. They'll come for you now, not just with words. I nodded. I know. You're not afraid? I am, I said. But I'm done pretending I'm not already marked. That night, they nailed something to my door. Not a cross, not a threat. A list of names. My mother's, my father's, mine, and Calem's. Every person in town who had ever been branded, silenced, exiled or forgotten. Some were dead. Some were hiding. Some were watching. At the bottom, scrawled in red ink like dried blood, "Let memory burn." They wanted me to forget, to pretend the fire in my bones was imagination, to close my eyes and go back to smiling in their churches, nodding in their shops, keeping my head down in their streets. But I was past pretending. I had seen the face of the forgotten, and she had smiled at me. So I wrote a letter. No threats, no rage, just truth. I copied the names, all of them. I tacked them to the church door. Then I sat down on the steps and waited. They gathered slowly, curious at first, then angry, then afraid. Pastor Howell came out last, his lips pressed tight, Bible clutched like a weapon. His eyes scanned the page, then found mine. "You think this is justice?" he said. "Digging up old rot? That girl, that creature, she was never meant to be remembered. That's the mercy the Lord gave us. Forgetting." I stood. "I don't want justice." He blinked. "I want them to rest." The silence that followed felt like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled. People shifted, murmured. Some stepped back. Others stepped closer. For the first time, I saw doubt in their eyes. Not everyone. No, but enough. Enough to matter. The next days blurred. Some cursed me. Some whispered thanks. A boy left me a basket of bread on my step. A woman screamed that I had doomed the town. A letter came in the mail unsigned with 2 words. I remember. Caleb kept close, but not too close. He knew this had to be mine. This fire. This choice. Then came the knock. Midnight? 3 of them. Coats, hats, guns, sheriff among them. I opened the door, barefaced, spine straight. "You're being summoned," he said. I didn't ask where. I already knew. The town hall. Every seat full. Every eye on me. Not a trial. Not officially. But it felt like one. They called it a gathering of concerns. Said it was time for the town to restore order and protect its future. Code for make her stop talking. Make her forget again. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by old wood and older hatred. And I did the one thing they never expected. I told the story. Not just mine. Hers. The child in the wind. The deal they made. The blood they offered. The silence they sealed. I said her name, or the closest thing I had to it. Little one. I watched the room crack. Some scoffed. Some wept. Some simply left. But I kept talking, because they needed to hear it, even if they hated me for it. Especially if they did. When I finished, no one clapped. No one yelled. Just silence. One long, aching pause. Then a chair scraped. Pastor Howell stood, walked down the aisle, and slapped me. Hard. Blasphemy, he hissed. Witchcraft. Lies. But I saw the tremble in his hand, and I knew I had won something. Not everything, but a start. They didn't kill me. Not yet. But from that day on, I wasn't a girl. I was the new heretic. A title they gave me out of fear. One I wore like armor. Because if remembering made me dangerous, then I would be the most dangerous woman Coldwater had ever known. Caleb met me outside, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. They'll come again, he said. I hope they do, I replied. Why? So I can show them what a ghost really looks like. They started coming in the night, not the townsfolk, the others. The ones whose names were burned off tombstones, whose faces had never been painted, whose voices had been taken from the wind. I didn't see them, not clearly, but I felt them, like whispers behind my teeth, like footsteps beneath the floor, like memory walking around in the shape of bone. It began 2 days after they called me the heretic. I had returned home to the charred remains of the store, now half covered in canvas and soot, and found feathers laid across the doorway. Not scattered, not accidental, placed. Each one was black, brittle, and broken at the stem. Ravens? Maybe. But they weren't a warning. They were an invitation. Calum said nothing when I showed him. He simply looked to the north, toward the mesa, toward the burial grounds his people no longer spoke of. The ones Coldwater built a church next to, but never over, as if even their concrete knew better than to rest where spirits waited. "We shouldn't go alone," he said. "We never are," I replied. That night we walked. No lanterns, no trail. Only the moon and the map my blood had begun to draw on the back of my skin. We crossed the dry riverbed, climbed the brittle bluff, and reached the stone ring just as the wind shifted. There was no sound. But I felt breath on my neck. I turned, and she was there. The girl of smoke, of ash, of forgotten lullabies. But she was not alone this time. Behind her stood others. A dozen, maybe more. Men and women, children and elders. Some with painted faces, some with shattered skulls, some half-formed, like the land itself had only partly let them go. They stood in a circle, not touching, not speaking, watching, waiting. And then the girl, the little one, stepped forward. She reached into her chest and pulled something from beneath her ribs. A shard. Glass? Bone? I couldn't tell. She held it out to me. Calum grabbed my wrist, tight. "You don't have to," he said. "I already did," I whispered, and took it. Pain lanced through my hand, but not sharp. Not hot, cold, ancient. I saw flames, chains, a church being built over graves, a woman screaming a name she was never allowed to pass on, and my mother, younger, frightened, hiding a bundle beneath floorboards. The shard vanished into my skin. I gasped, and all of them, the dead, breathed with me. When I woke, it was morning. Calum had carried me back, though he wouldn't say how, but something had changed. In me, and in the town. That day, Mary Holloway showed up at my door. She was 80 if she was a day, always dressed in black with her lace gloves and milky eyes. She hadn't spoken to anyone in 15 years. But she came and sat on my porch like she belonged there. "I remember," she said. I stared at her, unsure. "I remember her," she continued. "The little one. She came to me once when I lost my baby, stood by the cradle, didn't speak, just hummed. The child stopped crying, slept the whole night through. Tears filled her eyes. She wasn't evil, she was forgotten. And now you've brought her back." She took my hand. "They'll come for you harder now, but you're not alone." Then she left. I didn't see her again after that. The next morning, I found the chapel doors wide open, and inside, drawn across the walls in soot and ash, were symbols. Old ones from before English, before Latin. Calum's face went pale when he saw them. "They're not threats," he said. "They're memories." I touched one. It burned cold. Whispers spread fast. Some said I was summoning devils. Others said I was healing ghosts. One man claimed he saw a figure walking in the cemetery, barefoot, trailing mist. But no one could deny this. The air had changed. Animals grew restless. The well water tasted like copper. And at night, the wind sang. Then came the letters. Folded, handwritten, unsigned, slipped under doors, tied to fence posts, hidden in baskets. They all said the same thing. I remember too. It wasn't just me now. Others were waking up. Not all and not loudly, but enough. Enough to make the sheriff start patrolling in pairs. Enough to make Pastor Howell stop preaching about obedience and start warning about fire. Enough to make the mayor call for an emergency assembly, the kind they hadn't used since the drought of '79. And I kept walking, kept listening. Because the dead didn't speak like we do. They whispered through signs, through birds falling from the sky, through children drawing faces they'd never seen. And when you listened long enough, they told you everything. One night, Calum took me to the edge of the old hollow creek. "It's where they buried the first," he said. "The one who cursed the town, or saved it. Depends who you ask." We found the marker beneath a willow, nearly erased by time. No name, no date, just 3 carved lines. I traced them. The world tilted. Suddenly, I was underground, not in body and memory. I stood in a root-choked cavern, watching as a woman bled onto stone, whispering prayers in a language I didn't understand. Then I saw them, the town founders. 3 men in black coats. They nodded. She screamed, and the ground swallowed her. I woke with blood on my palms. Callum didn't ask. He just nodded. We're close now, he said. Close to what? He looked to the town, to the part where they decide if you live or burn. That week, I wasn't just a heretic. I was a symbol of rot, of truth, of the memory they couldn't kill. I stopped hiding. I wore red. I sang her song aloud in the streets. And on the 7th night, someone lit a torch outside my home. But they didn't throw it. They knelt, and they sang with me. It began with birds falling from the sky. Not hundreds, just a few. But they landed in places that mattered: the church bell, the sheriff's hat, my porch rail. They fell silent and still, and the air shifted like a storm was gathering from the ground up instead of the sky down. By then, no one called me Adeline anymore. I was her. The girl, the witch, the ghost whisperer, the cursed seed growing in the middle of cold water. But I didn't shrink from the name. I wore it like armor. Because truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. And truth was rising. The old women were the first to return. Not return from death, not like the girl in smoke, but return to memory. To something they had buried under decades of obedience. They came with hair like snow, skirts like faded prayers, and eyes that had watched their daughters disappear into cruel marriages and silent graves. They came with songs, fragments, really half-hummed things remembered from their own mothers, in words they didn't understand. One by one, they gathered at the willow tree where Caleb and I had unearthed the forgotten. And when they sang, the wind stood still. On the 5th day of the new silence, Pastor Howell declared war. He didn't say the word, but we heard it in his voice. "We must cleanse," he shouted from the pulpit, face red with rage and fear. "This town has been infected by lies, by spirits, by heathens. The Lord commands us to purge." He stared straight at me, and I did not blink. That night, they burned Caleb's tent. He wasn't inside. He never would have slept on open ground again, but the message was clear. Go home, or go in flames. Caleb didn't speak. He simply placed stones around the ashes. 12 of them. Old tribal tradition. A mark of warning, or a spell of protection, depending on how you looked at it. And that's the thing. Everything was about how you looked. Evening came heavy with ash and heat. Coldwater was not a town anymore. It was a wound, open, raw, and festering. On one side stood the ones who remembered the women, the few brave men, the children who had begun drawing spirals on their school papers. On the other, those who clung to the lie. Order, God, clean lines, empty graves. They wanted things silent again, but the silence had already broken. And the dead don't forgive easily. I stood in the town square that night, not hiding, not praying, not screaming, just standing. The moon overhead, my red shawl wound around my shoulders, Caleb beside me like a shadow carved from earth. And one by one, they came. Not hundreds, this wasn't a revolution, but enough. Enough to be seen. Enough to make the sheriff stop in his tracks. Enough to make the pastor close his mouth mid-sermon. Enough to make the mayor sweat through his collar and pretend he wasn't trembling. They stood across from us. One side in black, the other in breath and blood. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a child stepped forward. Her name was Eliza May, 6 years old, bow in her hair, dirt on her hands, a blue dress sewn by a grandmother now buried under the church. She walked to me, held up a doll made of twine and feather, the way the little one had once been honored. "I saw her," she said. "She sang to me when my papa hit mama." Her voice shook. She made him stop. Then she looked at the others. "Why are you afraid of someone who sings?" No one answered. But in that silence, 1,000 years of shame cracked. The next day, things shifted. Supper first. A fence painted red. An old hymn hummed with different words. A man refusing to serve the sheriff at the diner. But by sundown, it was clear. Coldwater had split. Those who remembered, and those who would rather burn the past than face it. I knew what was coming, so I prepared. We gathered in the old barn on the edge of town, the one no one used since the storms washed its roof half away. It smelled of dust and thunder and things buried in rafters. We drew the signs. We traced the lines. We called the names not to summon, but to invite. There is a difference. And the dead know it well. Caleb placed the shard in the center, the one the girl had given me. It pulsed like a heart. We didn't need torches. The light came from below. Around midnight, we heard the bells. The church. 3 times. That was their signal. They were coming. Torches, ropes, guns. The silence had broken, but they would try to stitch it shut with fire and fear. Caleb looked at me. I nodded. We didn't run. We stood in the center of the barn, and when they arrived, they didn't find us. Because by then, we weren't in the barn anymore. We were under it. In the hollow. In the place where the first woman had been buried. The place where memory never truly dies. The townsfolk searched for hours. They lit fires, shouted threats, dragged the old women from their porches and demanded names. But no one gave us up. Not one. Because they had remembered, and memory is a kind of magic. At dawn, we rose from the hollow. The earth had marked us now not with wounds, but with truth. A spiral on Caleb's wrist. A song etched behind my eyes. And the dead walking not behind us, but with us. Not ghosts. Echoes. Living memory. And Coldwater would never be silent again. The first to die was Jonah Ellis. I remember his hands more than his face, how they trembled when he handed me his mother's locket, whispering that she had danced with a Comanche once under the silver rain. He said it like a confession, like something he had no right to say aloud, but also something that refused to stay buried. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. No final shout. No heroic stand. They found him behind the feed store, face down in the dirt. His hands, missing, as if memory itself had been punished. And that was how it began. They called it the cleansing. Night by night, door by door. The sheriff's men, and the men he armed, fathers, brothers, even sons, now walking through Coldwater with rope in one hand and scripture in the other. They didn't wear uniforms, but they wore purpose. And purpose, when laced with fear, becomes something more dangerous than hate. They didn't kill openly. They erased. They burned books, dug up graves, forced families to denounce their own in front of others. Caleb watched, stone-eyed. I could feel the storm in his chest, but he never raised his voice. Not once. He waited, like the land waits for thunder. I kept a list. It wasn't written on paper. It lived in my head. Jonah Ellis. Kuradent. Father Louis, though he never spoke against them, simply vanished one morning. 3 school children whose names I couldn't forget even if I tried. June, Rebecca, little Thomas, whose fingers still smelled of chalk. They had drawn the spiral in the dirt outside the schoolhouse. Someone saw. That was all it took. There was no mourning. Not in the old way. People grieved behind drawn curtains and bitten lips. Grief was silent now, not because it lacked pain, but because it had become dangerous. To cry too loudly was to remember too publicly. And they were watching. I stopped sleeping. Not out of fear, but out of duty. If I closed my eyes, I feared I might forget. And if I forgot, I'd be no different than them. The little girl came again. Not in fire this time, but in shadow. She stood at the end of my bed and whispered names I didn't know. Old names, names buried in roots and riverbeds. When I woke, they echoed in my mouth like blood. I wrote them in the dirt under the barn. Kalem found me doing it. He didn't ask what they meant. He just placed his palm over mine and said, "You've been marked." Marked by who? I asked. He looked out toward the hills. By what remembers. That night, I lost Ruth. She was the only woman in town who had dared braid her gray hair with red thread, the thread Caleb had given the first night he'd healed her broken leg. They found her at the well, mouth stuffed with soil, hair torn out, one braid left trailing across the stones like a warning. I couldn't scream. I couldn't weep. I buried her myself. Caleb stood watch, with a blade carved from obsidian and bone. He said nothing. Neither did I. The ground spoke for us. We began to fight back, not with bullets, with memory. We etched symbols into walls, left feathers where lies had been spoken, buried stones in the shape of circles behind churches, under the sheriff's porch, in the pastor's garden. They didn't know what they meant. That was the point. Fear comes faster when you don't understand. And Coldwater was full of fear now. The mayor fled. No one stopped him. His house stood empty, curtains fluttering like ghost voices. I went inside once to see if he'd left anything worth remembering. I found a book, handwritten, notes from his grandmother, recipes, spells, lullabies. The line between them was thin. I read it aloud to the earth behind the barn. Caleb listened, ears closed. At one point, he wept. The kind of weeping that doesn't need sound. The kind that comes from remembering something you were taught to forget. People began gathering again. Despite the danger, despite the fire, they came to us with old things, hair combs, knives, ash jars, bark with names carved into them. They wanted to belong again. They wanted to stop pretending they were born empty. Each one who came, we marked with a spiral, not on the skin, but in story. We told them their names, where they came from, the first blood their grandmothers spilled to survive. And something strange began to happen. Their backs straightened, their hands steadied, their eyes cleared. Memory has weight, but it also gives you shape. On the 17th night of the burning, they came for Caleb. They didn't find him, but they found his horse, gutted and strung up outside the chapel. The message was clear. He was next. He didn't run. He stood taller. "Let them come," he said, voice like stone cracking. "Let them see what forgetting has cost them." Caleb. I tried to say more, but the words stuck in my chest. He looked at me. Not soft. Not hard. Just true. They can break my bones, but they will not erase me. That night, we lit the hill. Not with fire, with song. The old women came again, joined by children who had once been too afraid to speak. The melody wasn't one language. It was many. It rose like smoke, and when it reached the sky, the stars blinked. One fell, and in its light, we saw them approaching. Guns, ropes, Bibles turned into clubs. The sheriff at the front, face twisted with something between fury and sorrow. He shouted my name, not witch. Not girl! My name, Adeline. As if he still believed he could reach me. But he was too late. Because I had remembered. Because we all had. And the hill no longer belonged to Coldwater. It belonged to those who would never forget. They came before dawn. Not with torches this time. With silence. With wrapped boots, muffled steps, and the kind of breath you hold when you're about to bury something still warm. They surrounded the hill like hunters who'd memorized the path of a dying beast. But we were not dying. We were remembering. And that makes a different sound. Caleb had already left. He moved like the land, moved quiet until it wasn't. He said to me the night before, "When the fire comes, don't try to save me. Light it from both sides." I didn't ask what he meant. I understood. Some men are not saved by being spared. They are saved by being seen burning in their truth. I waited in the barn, not hidden, planted, like a seed that had already decided what kind of tree it would become. I held nothing in my hands, but I carried everything in my chest. The list, the songs, the faces, the old spiral, carved now into my shoulder, not by blade by bone pressed against bone, until it remembered itself. The sheriff came first. Alone, no weapon drawn. But make no mistake, he was armed. His guilt clung to him like a second skin, stitched tight by prayers he no longer believed. He stepped into the barn like he expected to find a ghost. I did not give him one. He found me alive. And that scared him more. You've poisoned this town, he said. No hello. No pretense. Just the lie he needed to believe to keep breathing. I smiled not kindly. You mean I reminded it? His jaw clenched. Do you even know what you're protecting? I stood. He flinched. Not from fear, from recognition of something he had once seen in a mirror long ago before he scrubbed it out with sermons and sweat. I'm protecting what you tried to bury, I said. He pointed to the spiral carved into the post behind me. That mark? That's not history. That's blasphemy. I walked toward him slowly. Funny. That's what they said about your mother's lullabies. His eyes widened. Just for a moment. I saw her in him. Then it was gone. Replaced by something cold. Final. He stepped aside. Let them in. Dozens of them. Faces wrapped in cloth. Eyes gleaming with the righteousness of the newly recruited. They dragged Caleb in like a prize. Bleeding. Not broken. He stood on his own. But he bled from places that don't bleed unless someone wants you to remember the pain. They threw him at my feet. He looked up at me, smiled, whispered, now light it. And I did. Not with matches. With truth. I began to speak. Out loud. Not a chant. Not a scream. A recitation. I told them the names. All of them. From Ruth, to Jonah, to Father Luis, to the 3 schoolchildren who had only drawn spirals. I told them what had been taken, what they had helped take, and as I spoke, others emerged from the trees, from behind stones, from under homes, dozens, then hundreds, marked, not in ink, in memory, and they echoed me. Name after name, pain after pain, until the names became louder than the guns. The sheriff shouted, Disperse, this is not your land. Caleb laughed. Even bleeding, even dying, he laughed. You still don't get it, do you? The sheriff aimed his rifle. I get enough. I stepped in front of Caleb. No weapon. Only the brand on my skin. He hesitated, then pulled the trigger. Silence. No shot. The rifle jammed, or refused. Some things cannot be made to kill truth. In that silence, the people moved. Not like soldiers. Like roots breaking through stone. They advanced not with rage, but with remembrance. The barn caught fire. No one knew who lit it. Maybe it was Caleb's blood. Maybe it was justice finding oxygen. But it burned. Hot. High. Holy. And as it burned, the sheriff ran. The others? Some dropped their weapons. Others dropped to their knees. One woman wept not because of fear, but because she remembered the name I spoke that belonged to her sister. Caleb fell, not from pain, from peace. He knelt beside him, held his head. He whispered again, but not to me, to something beneath us. Take me back into the soil. Let me be story again. Then he was still, but not gone. We carried him to the spiral stones. Not buried, returned. The way a memory is returned to the heart after a long forgetting. The way a song is sung by the wind long after the singer is gone. That night, Coldwater changed. Not all at once. Not clean. But something shifted. They couldn't deny the names anymore. Couldn't unsee the spiral. Couldn't unhear the voices. And when the sun rose, the town stood silent, listening to a fire that still crackled inside every root. The fire beneath us had spoken, and for the first time in decades, the town had listened. They say silence can be loud. I never believed it until today. The morning after the fire, Coldwater wore a new skin. One scorched and cracked, raw and aching, but alive. The ashes still smoldered like whispered secrets between the cracked boards of the barn, the place where so many lies were burned away. I stood in the wreckage, hands covered in soot, the spiral on my shoulder aching like a heartbeat. Calum was gone, and with him, the last flicker of doubt that had kept me afraid. The sheriff had fled. Some said he would never come back. Others said the town had changed enough that he wouldn't dare. But none of that mattered anymore. Because what remained was not the absence of fear, it was the presence of truth. The people gathered in the town square, not in anger, not in fear, but in stillness. I could feel the weight of generations pressing down on us, all of stories never told, names never spoken aloud. I stepped forward, the spiral brand burning beneath my skin, and I spoke not with bitterness, not with hate, but with the quiet force of a river breaking through stone. We have forgotten how to listen to one another. We have buried the past in silence and smoke, thinking it would stay dead. But the past is not dead. It breathes in us, in the dust beneath our feet, in the stones we walk upon. We are the sum of those who came before. And if we do not honor them, if we do not carry their stories, then we are nothing but empty shells, waiting for the wind to blow us away. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Faces once hardened, with suspicion softened. A woman stepped forward. Her eyes glistened with tears. She held a small wooden box inside, the locket of her sister, lost to the silence of years. She handed it to me. For her, she said, her voice steady. For all of us. I held the locket close and thought of Calum, of his laughter in the dark, of his blood spilled in the dawn. His sacrifice was a flame I would carry, not a burden, but a light. The spiral stones glowed faintly in the fading sun. I walked to them, carrying the box. I whispered a promise not to forget, not to forgive blindly, but to remember and to rebuild. The town had been scarred, yes, but scars are the marks of survival. Coldwater would rise from the ashes, not as a place of fear and secrets, but as a beacon of truth and reconciliation. Days passed. Weeks. The sheriff never returned. The newcomers stayed silent. But the town began to change in ways that couldn't be undone. The school reopened, walls repainted, but the spiral symbol etched into the wooden floor, a reminder of the past we would no longer deny. Neighbors greeted each other not with suspicion, but with wary hope. And I was no longer just the girl who carried the spiral. I was the voice for the forgotten, the keeper of the stories, the quiet brand that would not be erased. At night, I sometimes walk to the edge of the hill, where the wind carries the scent of pine and fire. I place my hand on the earth and listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I hear Calum's laugh riding the wind. Not a sound of pain, but a sound of freedom. Coldwater is no longer a town that hides in shadows. It is a town that knows the weight of its past and still chooses to stand. And as long as the spiral burns beneath my skin, so will the stories. So will the fire. And so will I. If you were in the main character's shoes, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video, it really helps the channel grow. Explore the other videos on the screen and dive deeper into these unforgettable stories.